My ex told me I was nothing without him. I wrote those words on a sticky note and stuck it to my computer. I looked at it every day for 2 years. It was the most useful thing he ever gave me. The sticky note was still on my laptop the day I walked into the most important meeting of my life. 2 years old, edges curling, written in black Sharpie and handwriting that was mine but felt like someone else's. Someone smaller, someone who still closed the bathroom door to cry so she wouldn't have to explain herself. You are nothing without me. I'd transferred it from laptop to laptop like it was something sacred. And I guess it was. Not because I believed it anymore, but because I needed to remember the exact moment I decided to prove it wrong. And more importantly, I needed to remember who was watching when I finally did. He was going to be in that room. I just didn't know it yet. I'd been with him for 4 years when the whole thing came apart on a Tuesday. 4 years is long enough to forget who you were before. Long enough to start borrowing someone else's vocabulary to describe yourself. Long enough that when you finally hear your own voice in your own head, it sounds like a stranger's. I met him through work. I was 26, working as a digital marketing coordinator at a mid-size agency in the city. The kind of place with exposed brick and a cold brew tap and a lot of meetings about brand voice. I was good at my job. I knew I was good. My manager had told me twice in 6 months that I had instincts she hadn't seen in someone my level, and I'd spent the following week trying to figure out what that meant for my trajectory. I also had a side project, small, careful, a content strategy consultancy I was running out of my apartment on evenings and weekends. 3 clients who paid me just enough to feel real. I hadn't told anyone about it yet, not even my sister, who tells me everything and expects the same in return. It felt too fragile, like a seedling you cover with your hands when someone opens the door. He walked into a networking event in February and introduced himself with the kind of confidence I confused for competence. Tall, well-dressed, strong opinions about everything from B2B conversion rates to the neighborhood we were standing in. He asked questions that sounded like he was listening, which I now understand is a skill some people practice. On our 3rd date, I mentioned the consultancy, casually, testing the water. He tilted his head slightly, I remember exactly how he did it, and said, "That's cute. What's your runway?" I told him. He said, "That's not enough. You'd burn through it in 4 months." He was wrong. I'd modeled it myself, but I didn't say that. I said, "Maybe you're right." That was the first thing I gave him that I shouldn't have. The corrections started slowly, so slowly that I didn't recognize them as a pattern until I was already inside it. He had opinions about my work clothes, not aggressive, just offhand. "You wear a lot of black. It reads as defensive in client settings." I started wearing color I didn't choose. He had opinions about my professional ambitions, also offhand, also framed as realism. The consultancy market is saturated. You'd be better served specializing inside an agency until you have 20 years of experience. I started hedging when people asked about my long-term plans. He had opinions about my personality. "You're a lot in group settings. You talk too fast when you're nervous and people can hear it." I started monitoring the speed of my own speech in meetings. I started counting sentences. I started finishing a thought and then wondering whether it had been too many words. I told myself this was growth. I told myself I was learning. I told myself that people who loved you told you hard truths, and wasn't that better than silence? Wasn't it better to know? Meanwhile, the consultancy contracted. 3 clients to 2, 2 to 1. I told the last one I needed to step back due to time constraints, which was partially true. I deleted the business email account on a Sunday afternoon while he watched football. He was talking about a game I didn't follow, and I was permanently closing something I'd built, and neither of us mentioned the other's thing. By the end of year 2, I'd stopped using the word founder entirely, even in my own head. The pattern had a logic to it that I only understood once I was outside of it. Inside the relationship, each correction arrived as isolated, reasonable feedback. The thing about sustained diminishment, and I say this not to be clinical, but because it took me a long time to name it, is that it doesn't announce itself. There's no moment where someone hands you a smaller life and says, "Here, this is yours now." It's gradual. It's the accumulation of 1,000 small adjustments that each feel like self-improvement, until one day you look up and realize you are standing in a room you didn't choose, dressed in colors you wouldn't have picked, speaking at a speed that belongs to someone else's comfort. I kept a journal during most of year 3 of the relationship. I stopped during year 4. Not deliberately, just stopped. The way you stop doing things you once needed when the version of yourself that needed them has been quiet long enough to seem like it's gone. I found the journal after I moved out, in a box I hadn't unpacked. I sat on my apartment floor and read 6 months of entries and did not recognize the person writing in them. Not because she was dramatic or broken, because she was so carefully, persistently cheerful in the face of things that should have made her furious. Entry after entry. He pointed out that I should be clearer in meetings. He's probably right. He thinks the consultancy idea isn't realistic right now. He knows this industry better than I do. He said I was too sensitive about the comment at dinner. I think he's right. I do take things too personally. I closed the journal and put it at the back of the closet. I didn't throw it away. Some part of me understood I might need to remember. My manager at the agency pulled me into her office on a Monday in March. She had been in digital marketing for 19 years, built 2 departments from scratch, and had the specific directness of someone who had survived a lot of bad leadership by refusing to replicate it. She shut the door. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth." I said, "Okay." She said, "What are you actually trying to do, career-wise? Not what you think you're supposed to say. Actually." I looked at the window for a second. Then I said, "I want to run my own firm." She said, "Then why are you still here?" I told her I wasn't ready. She looked at me for a long moment, the way people do when they're deciding whether to be polite or honest, and she chose honest. She said, "You were ready 2 years ago. I've watched you second-guess every instinct you have, and they're always right. Something happened. I don't know what it was, but whatever it is, I'd figure it out." I drove home, and I sat in the parking lot of my own apartment building for for 20 minutes. Then I went upstairs. I told him I wanted to restart the consultancy full time. I had 8 months of savings. I had a plan on paper, a real one, with projections, with a client acquisition strategy, with risk modeling he never knew I could do. I had 3 former contacts who'd already said they'd be interested in working with me if I went independent. He listened without interrupting. That should have been a sign. He always interrupted when he thought I was wrong. When I finished, he said, "You wouldn't last 6 months." I said, "I've modeled it out. I think I can be profitable by month." It's not about the model. You don't have the temperament for it. You need structure. You need accountability. You need someone setting direction for you, or you drift. I said, "I don't think that's true anymore." He said, "You've never run anything. You had a hobby. You quit the hobby because you knew it wasn't serious." I stopped because you knew. Deep down, you knew. My hands were very still on the table. Something in me had gone very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that means you've accepted something. The kind that means something has calcified. I said, "I'm going to do it anyway." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "You are nothing without me." Not cruel, not yelled, just flat, factual. Like he was reading a number off a spreadsheet. I nodded slowly. I packed a bag that night. My sister took me in without asking questions, which is why she is my favorite person alive. She has a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side and a cat who hates strangers. And for 2 weeks, I slept on her pull-out couch and the cat slept on my feet because animals know things. I got my own place on a Saturday. 1 bedroom in a building with a busted elevator and peeling wallpaper in the stairwell, and a neighbor who played bass guitar at volume 11 starting at 10:45 every night. I moved in with a second-hand couch, a coffee table, and my laptop. The morning after I moved in, I opened the laptop, found a black Sharpie in a box of office supplies, wrote 5 words on a sticky note: "You are nothing without me." I pressed it to the monitor, right below the screen where I'd see it every single time I sat down. Then I opened a browser tab, navigated to my state's LLC registration portal, filled out every field, paid the $75 filing fee, and submitted before noon. I made coffee. I drank it standing at the window looking at the parking lot below. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel brave. I felt terrified and completely fully awake for the first time in 4 years. That was enough. That was more than enough. Year 1 was construction. Not glamorous construction. Not the kind people describe in interviews when they've already made it and want to make the hard part sound meaningful. The actual thing, which is cold emailing 30 people to get 2 responses and delivering those 2 projects so well that one of them refers you to someone who refers you to someone. And slowly the machine gets a little bigger and a little louder. I rebuilt my client list from zero. I went to networking events alone and handed out cards I'd designed myself in a free Canva template at midnight and tried not to feel embarrassed about the Canva template. I hired a contractor, a former colleague who was genuinely brilliant at data analysis and very bad at sending invoices, and together we landed a mid-size e-commerce brand that became our anchor client for the next 8 months. I looked at the sticky note every day, not as a wound, as a compass. By month 6, I had revenue, real revenue, not enough to feel comfortable, but enough to prove the model wasn't theoretical. By month 9, I'd expanded the contractor to a part-time retainer arrangement. By month 11, I was negotiating my second major client and writing a proposal in a coffee shop at 7 a.m. because I'd run out of space to think in my apartment. My manager from the agency texted me after she heard through the industry grapevine that I'd landed the e-commerce account. The message was 3 words: "Told you so." I screenshotted it and put it next to the sticky note. Year 2 was different. Year 2 was when things started to feel real in the way that I'd only let myself imagine in very small doses, because hope is a thing you ration when you've been trained to be afraid of it. I brought on 2 full-time employees, both young, both sharp, both the kind of people who ask why instead of just doing it. And that is exactly the energy I wanted in every room. We moved out of my apartment and into a proper shared office space. Small, 1 room, a conference table that doubled as a lunch table, a whiteboard I filled and erased every week. I got quoted in a trade publication, 4 sentences, buried in a roundup piece about emerging boutique agencies. I printed it out and taped it to the wall. By month 22, I was chasing the biggest client I'd ever gone after. The retail chain had 11 locations across the region, a marketing department that had been running the same playbook for 4 years, and a digital presence so outdated it was actively costing them customers. They'd put out a formal RFP, a public request for proposals, and I spent 3 weeks on our submission. My team spent 3 weeks. We did a full competitive audit. We built a phased engagement plan with cost projections and ROI benchmarks. We included case studies from clients who'd seen measurable results and who had agreed, in writing, to be referenced. It was the best pitch document I'd ever produced. The confirmation came. We'd been selected as one of 5 finalists. The presentation meeting was scheduled for a Thursday 2 p.m. in a glass building downtown. I brought my partner, the contractor, who was now officially co-lead on all major accounts, and one of our full-time employees who had never been in a pitch meeting at this scale and needed to see how it was done. I wore a blue blazer. I brought printed copies of the deck because I'd learned the hard way that projectors fail. I had a backup clicker in my bag. I was ready. I was not ready for who was sitting on the other side of the table. There were 6 people from the client side: the CEO, who had flown in from Phoenix, the CFO, a woman with a reputation for asking the kind of questions that make consultants sweat, the VP of operations, 2 directors of various departments, and him, VP of marketing. He'd taken the role 6 months earlier. I found out later, much later. Relocated, career pivot, new title. He was sitting 3rd from the left, and when our eyes met across that conference table, there was a half second where neither of us moved. Then he looked down at his folder and I looked at the CEO, and I set my laptop on the table and I said, "Thank you all for making taking time. I'll get right into it. My hands were cold. The specific cold that's not temperature. It's blood redirecting. My body knew before my brain finished processing what it was responding to. But I opened the slide deck and I talked. I said every word I had prepared, and I answered every question that came, and I did not look at him unless he spoke directly to me. He waited until the very end. He leaned forward. I recognized the posture, the particular set of his shoulders when he was about to correct someone, and said, "Our last agency had a team of 40. I'm concerned about bandwidth. How does a shop this size actually execute at scale without compromising quality?" The room shifted slightly. A few people looked at him, then at me. I looked right at him. I said, "That's a fair question. Our model is purpose-built for focused engagement. We don't spread capacity across 40 accounts, which means your account gets senior attention at every stage. I'll send you our client retention data, which I think answers the bandwidth question better than headcount." I smiled, just barely, just enough. He didn't say anything else. The CEO followed up 2 days later. The email said they were impressed, said they were ready to move to contract negotiations, said they wanted to schedule a follow-up call early the next week. My partner and I stood in our office and just looked at each other. She said, "We actually did it." I said, "Don't jinx it." She said, "You're so annoying." I said, "Open the good coffee." We opened the good coffee. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was the CEO's executive assistant. She said there had been some concerns raised internally and that the evaluation process would need to be paused while they conducted an internal review. I asked what concerns. She said she wasn't able to share that information at this time. I said I understood. I hung up. I stood in the middle of my office and looked at the whiteboard and counted to 10 very slowly, and then I called my attorney. My attorney had been handling contract review for me since month 4 of the business. 14 years in commercial law, own practice, the kind of person who listens to a full situation before she says a single word and then says exactly the right one. She said, "Tell me what you know." I told her everything. The presentation, who was in the room, the history, the timeline. She said, "And you have no direct evidence of interference?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "Get me access to the RFP portal." The prospective client used a vendor management platform, a standard system where finalists could track their proposal status through the evaluation pipeline. My login still worked. I pulled up the dashboard and looked at the status field. It had changed from under review, final evaluation, to concerns flagged, internal review required. The timestamp on the status change was 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday, the Wednesday after the presentation. I sent the screenshot to my attorney, and then I sat very still for a while. My partner had a mutual professional contact inside the client company, someone who'd been in the marketing department for 6 years, knew the internal culture, and had reached out unprompted the previous year when we first started developing the pitch to offer background context about the company's needs. She texted my partner on a Friday afternoon. My partner forwarded it to me without comment. The message said, "Heard something in a meeting today I thought you should know. Your firm got flagged as a risk by someone on the eval committee. The reason given was that the principal, the founder, had personal history with one of our VPs, and there were concerns about professional judgment and emotional stability." I don't know who said it, but it didn't come from the CEO's team. That's all I can say. I'm sorry. Emotional stability. I read that twice, 3 times. My partner was watching me from across the desk. I said, "Forward that to the attorney." The letter went out on a Monday. My attorney sent it to the client's legal department directly. Formal, specific. It noted that a member of the vendor evaluation committee appeared to have participated in proceedings without disclosing a prior personal relationship with the vendor's principal, that unilateral modifications had been made to the vendor's evaluation status without committee authorization or process documentation, and that characterizations made about the vendor's principal to third parties may constitute actionable defamation. The letter referenced the possibility of tortious interference claims if the contract negotiation was not resumed on a fair basis. It was 8 pages. I read it 4 times before she sent it. The client's legal team responded in 46 hours. My attorney called me when the response came in and said, 46 hours is fast. Fast means they already knew. They were commissioning an internal ethics review. The Regional Business Ethics Board assigned the case to a senior commercial mediator with 12 years of experience in exactly this type of procurement dispute. She interviewed me twice, once on the phone, once in person in a conference room that smelled like old carpet and fresh anxiety. She was methodical. She asked the same questions from different angles. She was not warm and she was not cold. She was a process, and I respected that. On my second interview, she asked, "Did you at any point during the evaluation feel that the relationship with the committee member would be an issue?" I said, "I was surprised to see him in the room. I didn't expect to have to present to someone who had spent 4 years convincing me I couldn't do this." She made a note. She said, "Did you consider withdrawing?" I said, "No." She looked up. I said, "Why would I withdraw? I built something real. The pitch was real. The case studies were real. The results are real. Me being in that room was not the problem." She made another note. "The independent investigator the board brought in was a man who had spent 30 years in corporate ethics. He reviewed the vendor portal audit trail, the internal communications he'd been authorized to access, and the documentation my attorney had submitted. He interviewed 6 people inside the client organization. At one point, he asked me during a break between sessions whether I'd considered civil litigation. I said I hadn't decided. He said, "You have grounds." I said, "I know." The 6 weeks of the review were the longest of my professional life. I kept working. That was the only thing I could control. We had other clients. We had deliverables. I showed up every day and did the work and tried very hard not to check my email every 40 minutes waiting for something I couldn't predict. My partner watched me the way you watch someone you know is barely holding the structure together and doesn't want to be told. She didn't say much. She started quietly taking taking more off my plate, handling client check-ins I would normally run, fielding the questions that didn't need me. I noticed and didn't mention it because acknowledging it would have required admitting I needed it. My employee, the one who had been in the pitch meeting, who had watched all of this begin, came to my office one afternoon and asked if she should start looking for other jobs. She said it quietly, not unkindly, the way people ask things they're afraid of. I said, no. She said, are you sure? I said, we are going to be fine. The work is good. The pitch was good. The documentation is on our side. What's happening right now is a process, and the process is moving. We don't make fear-based decisions. That's not how we operate. She nodded slowly and went back to her desk. I closed my office door and sat there for a while. Then I pulled up the next pitch in progress and kept working. While the review was ongoing, he submitted a written statement to the board. He said he had verbally disclosed the prior personal relationship to HR before the presentation meeting. The HR director, when contacted, confirmed that no such disclosure had been made and that no documentation existed. He said his concerns about our firm were entirely professional in nature. The investigator asked him to identify any professional concern that had been documented prior to the status change. He could not identify one. He said I had shown erratic behavior during our prior relationship and that this informed his professional assessment. The investigator asked him to substantiate this claim with documentation or witness testimony. He could not. And then he made a mistake so specific and so perfectly calibrated to his particular brand of arrogance that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He sent an email to the CEO requesting a call to discuss the review. He meant to send it only to the CEO. He hit reply all. The email went to 17 people: the CEO, the CFO, the VP of operations, 2 board members who had been copied on the original review communications, several members of the legal team, my attorney's contact at the firm. In that email, he referenced me by name. He referenced our prior relationship. He wrote that I was someone who historically required a significant amount of professional guidance and that he had personal experience with her inability to maintain focus under pressure. Personal experience. The CEO forwarded it to legal within 50 minutes. My attorney called me when it landed in her inbox. She said, he just handed us everything. I sat down. She said, the reply all. He referenced personal experience. He named you. He characterized your professional capacity based explicitly on a private relationship. This is the documentation the board needed. I said, what happens now? She said, now it's not just an ethics complaint. It's a record. I want to be honest about what I felt in the days that followed, not triumph. That's not what it was. What I felt was tired in a way I don't have adequate language for. The kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. Because here was the thing I kept returning to. He'd done this with complete sincerity. He had not sat down and calculated a plan to sabotage my contract. He had genuinely, authentically believed that his assessment of me was correct, that his personal experience with who I was entitled him to override what the work itself demonstrated. He had watched me present a pitch that was detailed, substantiated, and impressive enough to get us into a final round with a major regional company, and his response was to go to a portal at midnight and flag me as a concern based on memories of who I'd been when I was still trying to fit inside the shape he'd built for me. He hadn't done it out of malice. He'd done it out of certainty, and somehow that was worse. The ethics board issued its findings on a Friday morning. I was at my desk alone. My partner was on a client call. One of our employees was at a location audit. The office was quiet the way it gets when everyone is focused. The email came in at 9:23 a.m. The findings were unambiguous. 1. A committee member had improperly participated in vendor evaluation without disclosing a prior personal relationship in violation of procurement ethics guidelines. 2. The vendor status change had been entered without committee authorization and without proper documentation, constituting a process breach. 3. Characterizations made about the vendor's principal to internal parties, emotionally unstable. Personal issues affecting professional judgment were unsubstantiated and potentially defamatory. 4. The reply all email constituted an explicit confirmation that the committee member's assessment was based on personal rather than professional grounds. The board referred the matter to the client company's board of directors with a formal recommendation for corrective action and a flag for HR review. He resigned the following Monday. I found out from the contact who'd first warned us. Her message was 3 sentences. He's out. Effective immediately. I thought you should know first. I read it at my desk, put my phone face down, looked at the whiteboard. My sister called 20 minutes later. I hadn't told her the details, some of them, but not all, because there were parts of this I needed to hold privately until it was resolved. But she had the specific instinct for when something big has shifted, and she said, you okay? I said, I think so. She said, what happened? I said, something ended. She said, good thing or bad thing? I said, it depends on how you look at it. For me, good, I think. She said, come over Saturday. I'll make food. I said, okay. Then I hung up and looked at the whiteboard for another minute. The whiteboard had the next client pitch in draft form. A different company, a different opportunity, the work continuing the way it does, whether or not anyone is watching. I picked up a marker and kept going. The CEO reached out the following week. Personal email, not routed through legal. He said he owed me an apology, not just a formal one, a real one. He said the process had failed and that he took responsibility for allowing a conflict of interest to go unidentified. He said our submission had been, and I'm paraphrasing because the specific wording still sits in my chest in a complicated way, the strongest we received by a significant margin. He said they still wanted to work with us if we were still willing. My partner looked at me from across the table. I said, pull out the original contract. We're renegotiating the terms. We got better terms. We signed 3 weeks later. 11 locations, 12-month engagement with a renewal clause we'd negotiated generated specifically. Revenue that was, in the most literal sense, everything I had once been told I'd never have access to. My partner ordered tacos, not champagne. Tacos, because we'd gotten champagne at the wrong moments before and had learned that tacos are better because you can eat them while you're still working. We ate them at my desk. The sticky note was on the desk lamp. 2 years old, faded, Sharpie gone slightly gray. My partner looked at it and said, "Is that the one?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "You should get rid of it now." I looked at it for a second. I said, "Not yet." My attorney called the week after the signing to ask if I wanted to pursue civil damages. She said I had grounds. She said the reply all alone was nearly a complete case. I said I'd thought about it a lot. She said, "And?" I said, "I got the contract. I got better terms on the contract than we originally proposed. My business is intact, my team is intact, and the story of what happened is now formally documented in a board-level ethics finding. He resigned. That's real." She waited. I said, "I don't need a judgment. I need the next client." There was a long pause. Then she said, "I'll close the file. I still have the sticky note, not because I need the reminder anymore. I know what I'm capable of. I have contracts and case studies and a team and a client list that proves it in language more permanent than a sticky note. I kept it because someday, when enough time has passed that all of it has softened into just a chapter in a longer story, I want to be able to hold that piece of paper and remember exactly what it felt like to be standing in that apartment with a packed bag and a voice in my head that wasn't mine. I want to remember it precisely, the way you keep a scar not to suffer from it, but to know what you survived. He said I was nothing without him. And I wrote those words on a sticky note and looked at them every single morning for 2 years. That sticky note never lied to me. It was just the first time he accidentally told the truth.